The Romans are a lot more politically sort of savvy in the way they go about their sort of politics and familial sort of relations. I think in Greece it's harder to get an idea because there are like 1,000 different city-states, so it's hard to generalize. But I think as a writer, Roman politics really is incredibly exciting to write about, and as a historian, it's what I love.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. The Classical World, the new book, The Missing Thread, A Women's History of Ancient Worlds. This is Daisy Dunn, the author, and she's done us all the favor of compiling a list of women over several hundred years, and in fact, 1,000 years if you look at the reflections upon them at the turn of the BC to AD, 1,000 years of women in part contributing to the building of the Greco-Roman world, the one we live with here in the United States and Europe lives with. The traditions of the Roman world are the traditions of the Greek world, our emphasis on democracy. Well, women were there all the time as mothers, as wives, and as schemers. And it's a joy to welcome Daisy Dunn to begin, of course, with the Iliad, written by Homer, except for there's a story that was started a long time ago, BCE, and continued into the 19th century and might still have some merit. That is that Homer was female. Daisy, congratulations, Phantasia. Who was she and who do we know her to be now? Good evening to you.
Good evening. Well, thank you. Phantasia is the woman who is rumored to be the originator of the tales of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So there's this idea that springs up in the ancient world. It's written down in some papyri, which are discovered later on, that she was this poet of a kind, and she came up with these stories. She wrote them out, put them in a temple, and trusted them to a temple, and that Homer actually went and found her versions and then used them to compose the Iliad and the Odyssey. So in a sense, this makes Homer a plagiarist and Phantasia the real author of the greatest epics from ancient Greece. But the big problem with this is that Phantasia never actually existed. There is the man who recorded this story was working at the Library of Alexandria, wonderful sort of center for learning, but he himself was quite a joker. And he sort of fabricated this idea. Phantasia in Greek, it means essentially, it's like a fantasy. It's a sort of a front. It's something that's made up. But that didn't stop lots of authors down history from believing the tale and believing that actually Homer might really have been a woman to some degree.
I like the story a great deal, Daisy, so I'm not going to give up on it because, as you point out, Homeros means fitter. Homer could very well be a person who fitted the story into his understanding, but where did he get it from? Who was Dido? How does that help us understand how women were regarded in the classical world?
Well, we go back. So what we know is when the Iliad and the Odyssey first came to being, even though they're the oldest pieces of literature that we have from the Western world, they contain stories and myths which were generations older than they are. So a lot of the stories they tell were already familiar to people when the Iliad and the Odyssey first came into being. And one of these is of Leda and the Swan. And you might have seen this if you visit ancient sites, or you might see sort of in paintings from the 19th century or other periods, a picture of a very beautiful naked woman with a swan in quite a suggestive position with her. And the myth is essentially that this beautiful woman who was married, she's living in Sparta. She was raped by Zeus, the king of the gods, who disguised himself as a beautiful swan. And as a result of that encounter, she gave birth to 4 children who came out of 2 separate eggs. And one of those children was Helen of Troy.
Yes, we now go to Troy, though maybe the Swan, maybe not the Swan, but definitely Troy. The walls of Troy demonstrate that something violent happened there, but many walls, many violent parts. At this point, the story that Homer tells, is it regarded as historical or mythological? Do we go back and forth, Daisy?
We do a bit. In the ancient world, most people believe that the Trojan War was a real historical event. In the modern age, by contrast, most scholars have said, oh, it's only a myth. It was made up. It kind of was something that was celebrated in Homer's work, but there's no truth to it. But actually, in recent years, the pendulum has begun to swing back slightly towards the idea that there might have been maybe not one big Trojan War, but a series of wars. And actually, if you look at the archaeological site of Troy, which is located in a place called Hijalik in modern Turkey, it shows evidence. There's a lot of destruction in the layers under the soil. They found weaponry. There's evidence of burning. And you can't conclusively say, oh, that's evidence of conflict, but it seems very clear that there was something that happened at Troy at the same sort of date that the Trojan War was believed to have taken place. So I'm actually one of those believers. I say that there was a war or some wars at Troy, and that the Iliad is almost a kind of commemoration of those events. It's a way of sort of marking what had happened way back earlier in time.
Helen, born of the Swan and the Beauty, is married to Menelaus. Paris abducts her and takes her to Troy. It's the beginning of the plot. It's a wonderful plot because what's going to happen now is the Iliad. However, again, there are characters in here that are important. Helen's very important, although the one I like is Hector's wife, Andromache. What do we learn from her in the Iliad?
She is presented on one hand as the dutiful wife. She is a great support to Hector. Hector is essentially the greatest warrior on the Trojan side. He's the brother of Paris. Paris hasn't got the same courage as him. Hector is very valiant and he really puts his duty first. And Andromache is a great support to him. She looks after their young son, Astyanax. But she's also, and this is what's really easy to miss actually when you look at these epics, she was also incredibly watchful, and she was looking at exactly what was happening with the Greek army. And she gives Hector in the poem some advice. She says she can see there's a section of wall, and that the Greeks are by this section of wall, and they might actually break in to the citadel. And so she actually gives some advice as to where to station his men in order to fortify their defenses even further. So even though her sphere is essentially domestic. She's the wife, she's the mother. She's also very engaged in the war that's taking place.
One other woman I like from the story, I don't believe she has any lines. Briseis, is that how I say it? The woman that Amnon takes from Achilles. Who is she? What place does she play in the classical world of understanding her part of the drama?
She's actually very central to the poem, though, as you say, we don't really hear her because she's presented in a position, she's been reduced to slavery. She is essentially the sex slave of Achilles. And the whole poem begins with her really at the center of it. Agamemnon decides to take her away from Achilles. And there's a whole dispute between Agamemnon, who's the brother of Menelaus, the leader of the Greek army, and Achilles. And there's a sense of real injustice over whose property she is. So she was one of many, many women who were taken away and made into slaves. And that's sort of part and parcel and reality of war, very sadly.
Yes, we have the three levels. There are many more levels, but we have Helen, who may or may not have existed. We have Andromache, who's shrewd and supportive of Hector. And we have Briseis, who becomes the reason for Achilles to withdraw from the battle, and therein lies the tale. However, we're going to move on to other classical understandings of women. Daisy's done us a favor of combining how the classical world saw these stories and the women in them, and how the modern world interprets these stories and the women in them. The book is The Missing Thread. Women are weavers. They spin, they spin, they spin. A Women's History of the Ancient World. Daisy Dunn is the author. Daisy is a classicist. She has the Greek, she has Latin. My understanding is she's going to conquer linear A and she has linear B, all these languages. We're going past the Minoans, although that's a wonderful chapter. The Minoans favored cosmetics. Others favored cosmetics too. We're now going to a part of the story that is well known if I say it takes place on the island of Lesbos. It's also well known if I say it takes place through the person of Sappho, the poetess. However, what it was not well known to me is that of the reputation of Lesbos, it was that it was women, beautiful women everywhere, the beauties of Lesbos, except Sappho was said to be short and dark. Was she considered homely, Daisy?
She is very unfair, I have to say, on poor Sappho, because we don't have any representations to be able to judge what she actually looked like. Most of the people who've described her as being very unattractive and short and dark, as you say, are people living hundreds of years after she survived. So they could not possibly have seen her. But the thing with Sappho is that because she comes from this island, which in the 7th century BC, when she was living, had long been established as a place where beautiful women resided, because she wasn't known for her beauty, she was known for something else. I think that kind of gave rise to this rumor that, okay, she was a poet because she wasn't one of the winners of one of the great beauty contests that was being held there. She wrote, or she composed and she performed instead.
Sappho was inheriting a tradition that was long-standing, poetry. And she invented something called the Sapphic stanza, which is quite different than hexameter. I'm unused to it. But at the same time, she was part of a political turmoil. Her brothers were part of a political turmoil. Mytilene was Sappho's city, and it was involved. This is on the coast of what we now call Turkey in the Hellene world. Sappho was involved through her brothers in 2 different cities, and I believe they had a correspondence with Athens. This is all happening at the same time. The dates I write down for when Sappho went into exile was 605 BCE to 590 BCE. What is happening in the Greek world at that time as with the 7th century turns to the 6th BCE?
It's a great period of change. So historically, it's been many of these city-states that form Greece have been ruled and occupied by the elite, by the aristocratic people in society. And suddenly there's a change. There are people who are rising up saying, that's not what we want anymore. We want to represent our people. We've come from a different sort of background. We want out with the old and in with the new. And Sappho is from an aristocratic family. So her brothers, her family falls foul of the sort of regime change that happens on Lesbos. And this is why we find her being sent off into exile. She goes to Sicily. And while she's there, there's a sort of a change in king. There's a change in leadership. And there are sort of various attempts. Lots of people sort of coups and things to try and overthrow these people. But they finally get a more stable leader. And he's actually praised as being a great sort of lawmaker. But essentially, sort of across the Greek world, this is a period of change and revolution.
And that's the period that Solon emerges from in Athens, the lawgiver. But we're talking of women here. Although Daisy's done us the favor of putting the women in context of the historical period, turning century after century. Daisy, I don't think I'll surprise you to say I was very taken by Doricha, the
Yeah.
woman who was so beloved by one of Sappho's brothers that he sacrificed things for her. And did Sappho write of her?
She did. I mean, with Sappho, we only have fragments of her work. They've been dug up on sort of little sections of papyri from Egypt. But we know that she wrote of this woman, Doricha, as we might call her. Pronunciations are always sort of changeable. She was essentially a courtesan. She was a prostitute working in Egypt. And one of Sappho's brothers, Caraxes, was a trader. And we read of him going over and essentially buying the freedom of this woman. And Sappho does not like this wonderful bit. She is infuriated by the decision of her brother to do this, not because she thinks that her brother shouldn't be seeing a prostitute. We don't quite know what the relationship between these two individuals was, but she thinks that it will make Doricha haughty and arrogant to be shown such favor by a man in her brother's position. And Doricha, we read of her in other sources as well. She actually uses some of this money to buy a selection of oxen spits, which she deposits at the site of Delphi, where the famous oracle used to proclaim. Doing so knowing that then people would visit in their thousands and they'd learn her name. So she'd become someone who was spoken about and remembered after her time. And I think Sappho just maybe had a bit of kind of class prejudice against her.
Competitive, you emphasize that. Sappho is competitive. Andromeda and Gorgo, two of her students who found separate schools. So Sappho was what you'd have to say the jealous boss of an Oxford of its time. Is that how to understand this?
That's a really interesting way of putting it. Yeah. So she has her own school for girls. She teaches girls music. Music is kind of performed with poetry as well. And she is really cross when two of her former pupils decide to one of them, Andromeda, sets up a rival school, and then this other girl decides to join it. So pupils are basically leaving her school and going to her former pupil's school instead. And rather than being pleased, she is just very, very jealous and quite protective of what she's established.
Sappho's poetry includes the images of weavers. Was that long established that women are weavers and they understood the metaphor for the weaving of your life? Did they talk that way?
I think so, very much so. I mean, weaving and ancient women go hand in hand. They do it for thousands of years through our history. We know in the Bronze Age, women were weaving, making extraordinary clothes. And then in the Roman period, likewise, they're all weaving, they're making their husbands' clothes. They're doing all sorts of things. But it went beyond the kind of practical use of weaving. There are stories, we know in the myths, people talk of at that time of the Fates. And the Fates were these sort of spinners who would spin out in the same way that women were weaving, the kind of course of people's lives. And there was certainly a parallel between these spinners and the sort of everyday spinning that mortals were engaged in.
Final 30 seconds, Daisy. Sappho, and we're unclear of, but there's one story saying she threw herself off a cliff for love. Do you believe that?
Absolutely not.
Neither do I. I'm glad to hear it. Daisy Dunn is the author. Missing Thread, A Women's History of the Ancient World. The Etruscans. The Etruscans are a people of the Italian peninsula before Rome. And the question is always, where did Rome come from? There's a version from the Aeneid written by Virgil, but there's also evidence that the Etruscans contributed to the building of Rome, people leaving the Etruscan cities and coming to the Tiber. However, where did the Etruscans come from? Daisy, you introduced us to DNA and modern archaeology. What have they discovered about the Etruscan background?
It's quite controversial. People have been wanting to know where the Etruscans actually came from for a very, very long time. And there are stories in some of these early Greek sources which some DNA analysis seems to support. And one of those stories is that people came originally to central Italy from what is now Turkey. At a time of great difficulty and plague. People came off in boats, and people have looked at, scientists today have looked at sort of the analysis of people's DNA and also cow and cattle DNA as well. And they found there are some similarities between people from Turkey and the certain area of Italy as well. Other people dispute that and say that DNA analysis is quite difficult to sort of verify, and they're more inclined to see the Etruscans as being the native peoples of Italy. So we don't know exactly where they came from, but we know that they were very, very prominent. They were very skilled, and they were the people who were dominating Italy way before the Romans became prominent.
The women were of great note. I believe they wear cosmetics like the Minoans. I believe that they have They have dentistry, false teeth, using gold like the Minoans. Were they in commerce with the Minoans? They don't overlap, I don't think. This is the what is this? The fifth century BCE.
There's
They
a
have
big
a lot of the same aspects of the Minoans.
You're right. There's a big gap between some Minoans were looking back to the Bronze Age, the Etruscans were looking somewhat later. But they are similar in that they're highly cultured, they're highly skilled, and the Etruscans have one up on the Minoans insofar as they seem to invent the art of orthodontics and sort of technical dentistry. So they come up with these ingenious ways of fixing teeth which have come loose. They have sort of braces, and they have these very kind of flash sort of pieces in the mouth, which are worn only by Etruscan women rather than men, which is quite interesting in itself.
They are, well, if they were in Hollywood today, they're filmmakers of romantic comedies and romantic dramas. You Daisy has one scene where a man and a woman are under a single blanket. There's a lot of romance in the images that they've left us,
Yeah.
uh, emphasizing they must have been a warlike people to stand up to all those jealous rivals. But in any event, was their understanding of romance discontinuous from what had gone before? Are they inventing the idea of men and women can get along?
They're inventing the idea that women and men can get along in public, I would say. This is what marks such a breach with what's come before, particularly when you're looking at the Greeks and the Greeks' reaction to the Etruscans. The Greeks are shocked by how openly loving the Etruscan men and women are to one another. Uh, the fact that they are reclining under the same blanket at the same dinner is really shocking to the Greek people, and they describe the Etruscan women as a result as being quite promiscuous and quite flighty, so much so they say that when they give birth to children, they can seldom be sure whose children those are, and therefore they raise those children communally altogether because they're not quite sure of their paternity, which I think is probably a reflection of Greek prejudice rather than the reality. But certainly the Etruscans seem to be a lot more open about love, and you find really quite sort of sexualized images even buried in the tombs of Etruscan women.
They have a government and spirituality that is very, very Roman-like, almost as if you want to say immediately the Romans took everything they developed from the Etruscans, and then you come right up against the Romans are Etruscans. Is there an opinion today, Daisy?
There's essentially the idea that the Romans developed a lot of their culture out of what was existing among the Etruscans, but ultimately they conquered them and came to dominate them. And this is quite a sort of a long, protracted period. And partly this stems from this kind of period where we're not sure whether it's exactly myth, whether it's exactly history. It's quite a hazy border between the two. And the idea is that Rome begins with the rule of a series of kings. And these early rulers are actually Etruscan in origin. So the
Right.
people who are actually establishing the foundations of Rome are Etruscan.
It's beginning to remind me how the English crown is German. You see?
Yeah. Yeah,
Wait,
nothing comes from nowhere. So.
yes. Rhea Silvia is the mother of Romulus and Remus. And women are weavers, and they're also the mothers of kings. Romulus becomes the king because Remus dies in the 8th century. Daisy makes the point that the Romans weren't fussy about what is true and what is a great story. They go back and forth. And uh, I'm okay with that because these are great stories. We'll tell the story of the rape of the Sabine women. This has to do with the fact that Rome believes itself founded by males, warriors, but there are no women. There's no future. So they trick the Sabines. How do they do it, Daisy?
This occurs to the Romans, the early Romans, as something of an afterthought. They've got this fantastic city. They're very proud of it. And then they realize, oh, how are we going to continue the future of our city because we haven't actually got any women here? So they need to try and attract women to their city. And they try to do this, but their attempts for some reason fail. So what they do is they invite in these neighboring people, and they invite lots of different people, but the Sabine people are some of their neighbors who do come. And essentially the daughters, the young virgins in particular, are carried off by these young Romans to become their wives. And at that time, the parents of those girls are blamed for being so proud and not kind of agreeing to hand them over willingly. But it's said that these girls are going to be rewarded by being the mothers of this great race to come, this great race of Romans. So the kind of propagation of the early Romans, it all begins with this very, very violent act.
Yes, and the settlement of this is that the women emerge saying, carrying the babies of the Romans, saying, you can't fight, these are your relatives. And that becomes the success of the women on the battlefield, making peace between the Sabine men and the Roman men. But that's one version. Now we have to tell another version. This has to do with Lucretia. Three men are telling stories and drinking wine one night, and they decide there's a contest on who has the most faithful wife. And how do they resolve it, Daisy?
They essentially decide to go and spy on their wives to see what they're really up to when the men aren't around. And in this story, most of these men's wives are found to be sort of gossiping, drinking, eating, not being very virtuous. But there's one man's wife who is doing precisely what women of her age are supposed to be doing, and she is sort of very quietly getting on with her domestic duties. I think she's actually weaving at that moment in the story. So she is exemplary, and her name is Lucretia. And one of the men in this party sees this woman, and he is overcome with desire for her. It's partly sort of envy of the other man for having this more virtuous wife, but it's also desire. So he decides to actually come back to her home on the following day. And because he's been there the day before, he's allowed in as a familiar face. And he goes and says to her, you either sleep with me or I will murder you and put the body of a male slave next to you. So it will look like you've committed adultery, essentially, with another man, and then died as a result of that. So she essentially has no choice. And he basically coercively forces her into sleeping with him so that she avoids that horrible fate. But afterwards, it's very, very difficult for her to carry on. So she resolves on suicide, having contacted her husband to try and get vengeance on this man for what's happened. And the result of that is essentially, this is an early Brutus in the story, related to a much more famous Brutus far, far in the future. This Brutus, at the instigation of Lucretia, overthrows the system of monarchy in Rome, and it gives way to the birth of the Roman Republic. And this is all because of Lucretia and her defiance and bravery, in a really, really torturous situation.
Yes, this is the end of kingship in Rome, goes the story. Again, remember, history and myth. There's a saying in one of our great cowboy movies, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, when fact replaces legend, print the legend. And the Romans were early to that. They understood. Now, a detail about this is that Lucretia is regarded as virtue itself by the Romans later on, correct? That's how they think of her. If her name ever comes up, that is the fundamental virtuous moment for Rome. Is that correct, Daisy?
Yes, that she's certainly very, very admired as a result of that. There were a few people who disputed that. There were men who were not beyond believing that if a woman was raped, somehow she'd taken some kind of enjoyment in it, and somehow she was impure as a result of that. But rightly, historians down the ages have been able to say, these men are totally wrong. And I think the weight of evidence is more in support and admiration of Lucretia.
Is Lucretia, when she's pictured by the Romans, does she have a spindle and a distaff? I wrote that down in my notes, but I don't remember.
She does often in artistic representations, particularly later in the Renaissance as well. She's often shown like that. And then also with a sort of dagger, preparing to kill herself.
And so again, weaving or cloth making or clothes making, that's associated with women, but they take it as metaphor, or the weaving the clothes the your life. You're putting together your life and it's going to end. So all the paintings see her as a paragon. Is that understood?
It is, yeah.
We're going to go to another paragon, Dido herself, who is another version of the founding of Rome. The book is A Women's History of the Ancient World. Daisy Dunn is the author. It is action-packed, and we don't have much time. There's attention to the Persian Empire. There's attention to all the details around getting from one epoch to another. I'm skipping lots. However, I'm attracted to the Dido story because, again, did she exist? Who knows? It's such a good story, you don't care. Because Dido, who has, I believe, a Carthaginian name, is the founder of Carthage. But the story goes that Aeneas, in Virgil's telling of the Iliad, Aeneas comes to meet Dido. Where did they meet, and what was their fate?
They meet in Carthage, which is this new city that Dido has built. She's created it having escaped from her native city of Tyre. And Carthage is in North Africa. And Aeneas has found himself there after escaping from the Trojan War. He's brought with him some of the survivors of that conflict. And he has a destiny to found a new home for himself, for his son, and for the survivors among his people. And when Dido meets with him, she initially hopes that he might settle with her and helped her to create this new city, which is still developing, the city of Carthage. But it doesn't quite go to plan.
It doesn't go to plan, but Venus intervenes.
She
Venus
does.
Venus shoots an arrow. Who does the arrow go? The arrow goes to Dido.
So
So
Venus is lucky because she is the goddess of love, but she is the mother of Aeneas, and she's also the mother of Eros or Cupid, who has control of these arrows. So she manages to direct an arrow to Dido, so she falls completely hopelessly in love with Aeneas.
and Dido is not a victim. How do they regard this when you get shot by Cupid? You're lucky. You're unlucky. They don't know.
It varies from story to story. In this particular case, it sets up this idea that she's going to be a tragic heroine to some degree, because we know that Aeneas hasn't found the place where he needs to create this new city. We kind of know that his destiny does not lie with her. So at that point, from the moment she's struck by the arrow, we sort of know that she's doomed.
Now, all this takes place in the context of Carthage. And we need to say that Dido is a very clever person. Dido leads the exodus as well from across the Aegean to the land where Carthage is. It's Tunisia today. And there's a local king, and she makes a deal with the local king. We believe that Dido's Phoenician, or that,
That's right.
yes.
Yes.
So she speaks a different language. And you were very convincing in saying that Carthage is named for two Phoenician names, Kart Adasht, which I guess means, well, it's how she finds the land. And she tells that the local king, will only take as much as an oxhide skin can cover. And how does she trick him, Daisy?
Well, he agrees. He said, sure, okay, you can have an oxhide sized piece of land. And then she takes that oxhide and she cuts it up into the thinnest strips you can imagine, and then lays those strips end to end so she can encompass this vast area in order to build a new city. And there's this fantastic hill in the middle of the city, and it's known as Bursa, and that comes from the word for oxhide, essentially from ox. So it kind of commemorates her foundation of the city.
Now, what attracted me about Dido is the next bit. There's a twist. Dido knows that Aeneas is living and she curses him. Uh, you've quoted some of the curse. Is it a long curse? Does it have many avenues?
Well, the crux of this curse, I mean, she's furious with him when he says he's got to go away. So she says, "May there be no pact of friendship or peace between our peoples." And in the context of the poem, you think, okay, fair enough. She's a woman who's been scorned. She's perfectly entitled to curse him with what she likes. But historically, this took on a huge meaning, because in the centuries to come, there would be a series of wars between the people of Carthage and the people of Rome, the Carthaginian Wars, which would stretch over centuries. And these wars had already taken place by the time that Virgil was composing this poem. So that curse really resonates with people who are reading the Aeneid.
Yes, and now Dido will destroy herself in one version. There are always two endings if you don't like it. Which ending do you like? That Dido destroys herself or she marries a local king?
It's a tricky one. I mean, neither are great, but I mean, the more famous version, the one that Virgil goes with, is that she sees Aeneas sailing away, and she has her sister essentially put all of his belongings that he's left behind on a pyre, and then she jumps onto this funeral pyre and basically burns herself to death. And then they later meet in the underworld. I think it's probably slightly nicer to imagine the other version where she ends up having to meet and marry this king, but that in itself isn't particularly glorious or happy either. I mean, you like to think of her carrying on ruling her own people, maybe meeting someone else a bit further down the line, but it's not particularly happy for poor Dido.
It's a spectacular end. Is she held responsible for falling in love with Aeneas because she broke her vow of celibacy? Is that seen as a curse, as a weight on her?
It is among her own people. As soon as she is brought together with Aeneas, they make love in a cave. This is engineered by the goddesses above. And rumor spreads very, very quickly. And the people say, oh, well, she's a widowed woman and she's broken her celibacy. And there's a sort of slight ill feeling towards her. But I think from that moment on, when Aeneas decides to leave her and abandon them as a people, maybe sympathies would shift at that point.
Right. Daisy Dunn, the classicist and author of the new book, The Missing Thread, A Women's History of the Ancient World. Iliad's behind us. The Odyssey's behind us. Etruscans have become Romans. And here we are in the 2nd century BCE. Two brothers, known collectively today as the Gracchi, are convinced that the Roman elite must be challenged by laws that favor the plebeians, the common people. Sound familiar? They're reformers. However, they come up against a Roman Senate and a Roman elite that is not going to give in, and it turns to tragedy. But in this is one character who emerges as behind the scene of these two brothers, the Gracchi. And that is Cornelia, their mother, celebrated by centuries since then. Daisy, thank you very much for this. What do we need to know about Cornelia? Because she stands apart from all the tragic ends. She stands apart from all the women who eventually are widowed and find themselves without power. She's very powerful. Is she somebody who we can say taught her sons to be reformers?
I think so. She came from quite a prominent family. She was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, one of the heroes of the wars fought between Carthage and Rome. And she was very well educated. She knew Greek, she knew Latin. And we're told that she had, or at least conceived, 12 children, of which three survived. And she took control of their education because she was widowed while she was still quite young. So she had two sons, Tiberius and Gaius, and a daughter called Sempronia. And she was renowned for being very eloquent. She was good at talking. And when people wrote about her in the ancient world, they said they could see where her son's eloquence and sort of ability to kind of sway the crowds came from. They kind of believed that oratory was one of those skills that could actually be passed down in the blood. You can inherit those skills. So Cornelia, I think, was clearly a very intelligent woman, a very capable woman. And she was also fiercely independent. She, having been widowed, refused the advances of many, many men, including an Egyptian Ptolemy, and decided to remain was known in Latin as a una vira, which means a one-man woman. So it was her and her children, and they were very much her future.
Yes, and her children, Tiberius, the two brothers, they each of them take Tiberius and Gaius take the same route, which is to challenge the elite by becoming plebes and head of the plebeian tribunate. In other words, there's a lower house, sort of like the House of Representatives or Commons, and then there's an upper house like the Lords or the Senate. And the Senate and the Lords are all powerful. These are the richest men in in Rome. And the brothers serially take them on over a period of time with really good ideas that all become adopted. Some of them don't even go away after a brother who introduced it is dead. And Cornelia is watching this happen. So let's recommend her for it. However, I want to make certain I understand the Gracchi's position. They would have been the right age to be Caesar's father. She would have been right age to be Caesar's grandmother. Is that about right, Daisy?
Yes, that's about right.
So Caesar grows up with the legend of the Gracchi and the story of Cornelia. Is it celebrated? Does he hear it positively?
I think so, definitely. These are two brothers who really changed the future of Roman politics. I mean, Julius Caesar came to the fore by being a great populist. He appealed to the masses. And these two brothers very much got there first. They were saying that land distribution really favored the rich. It wasn't fair the way that things were. And they had all these ideas for reform of land in particular. And they carried on. They basically did something which was unconstitutional officially. They decided to remain being tribunes of the plebs beyond after the sort of official term ended. You're supposed to sort of do that for a term and then you carry on and you move up the ladder. But they decided they want to stay working with the plebeian people. And this was too much for the Roman Senate to bear. And the elder of the brothers by 10 years, who's Tiberius, is assassinated as a result of his perceived politicking. It seemed to be so dangerous what he's doing. It really sort of overturning the status quo. And Cornelia then sees her second son, Gaius, rise up and say that he wants to do exactly the same thing as his brother and run for this office again. And we actually have, this is incredibly rare, we have part of a letter that she wrote to Gaius, trying to deter him from doing this, asking him to have some patience and to have some sympathy for her as she was aging, because it's just too much for her to see him run the same sort of risk as his older brother.
Yes, and it's very sad, but it becomes the legend of the Gracchi. There are dictators in between. There's Sulla. Well, I want to stay with Caesar because he's learning about the Gracchi. And Caesar, as a young man, is a rascal. As a middle-aged man, he's a rascal. And I believe when he's 41 or just turning 40, he meets a woman named Servilia. Who is she?
She is the half sister of Caesar's enemy in the Senate, who's Cato. And so from the beginning, this marks her out as a woman who's going to land Caesar really in trouble with his colleagues for getting involved with. But she ends up being his long-term mistress. Julius Caesar married several times, but he was having affairs all over the place. He loved having affairs with other senators' wives. He had a reputation for being quite a womanizer. But Servilia is one of these women that he really seems to have shared a lot of things in common with. They're the same age. They'd both been married the same number of times. She had her own children. She stays with him and he buys her the most expensive pearl in Rome and makes her the richest woman in Rome. Her son, the famous one, is Brutus. Brutus, come 44 BC, is one of the lead assassins of Julius Caesar. So she is a woman who's very much between her blood and her lover, Caesar. She's stuck in the middle between the two of them.
You're professors because you've had this training. Did any of them ever note that the whole of Rome obeys the economy of scene that we have at the theater? That people take different roles, but it's the same actor all the time? It seems awfully convenient. I know it's history, but isn't
Mm.
it amazing that Servilia, her son murders Caesar and becomes a liberator? Caesar, of course, is the man who founds the basis for the Roman Empire. And it's all spinning around Servilia.
Yeah.
Uh, did she leave a record of her remarks or opinions?
We have a little bit more on her. We know that when Brutus was surviving and he'd become this liberator after the death of Julius Caesar, he was put in charge of a grain commission. And she thought that was a bit of a lowly job for him because Caesar had said, oh, you can be consul, which is like right at the ceiling of the Senate. And so we know that she actually overturned that ruling. It was an edict passed by the Senate. She had it changed so that Brutus could get a higher powered job. So we do have some insight into her politicking and her own right.
There's a civil war. Caesar's plunged into it. Pompey is his enemy. There's history going on right through this book, but what Daisy's done is concentrated on the women who see all this. I mean, this is the mother of Brutus, the man who Caesar might very well have adopted rather than Octavian. We could somewhere out there in the world of many universes have a completely different story of Rome. And now we turn to what happens to Caesar when he defeats Pompey and meets a woman named Cleopatra. These Romans all know the Greek stories. They know the Greek drama. The Greeks are very serious. The Roman theater is nowhere near as serious. Rome likes farce. Rome likes comedy. Caesar has comic moments, but not recently. Caesar defeats Pompey, and Pompey runs to Egypt, where his wife tries to have a successful reunion with him. However, Pompey's murdered by a man who thinks he's under orders to kill Pompey. Caesar mourns it, mourns Pompey's death. And then, because he's walked into Alexandria, which is the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, he's in a palace and someone brings in a rug. Yes, it's real true. It's not a theater piece. It's a rug. And it's unwrapped before him. And who emerges from the rug, Daisy?
It is a young Cleopatra, and she's Cleopatra the seventh. We have to remember there are other Cleopatras who've ruled Egypt before her. And she's come before Caesar, and this is a great sort of piece of theatre. She is unwrapped, and she essentially meets with him and is determined to have a conversation with him because the rule in Egypt is very, very difficult at that moment. In Egypt, it's sort of customary that you marry your brother in that position. But Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy, are basically at war. And Ptolemy's tried to he's driven her out, and the will of their father says that they should jointly rule the country. But it's basically in total disarray. So Cleopatra needs to prevail on Caesar and try and get him to help sort out the situation.
Yes, now there is reason to believe that Caesar at this point is thinking empire because the civil war is nearly concluded. I believe Cato the Younger is still alive, but in any event, he's in Alexandria. The reason she's in the rug is because she needed to sneak into the palace without her brother knowing it. An army gathers outside the palace, these grounds in Alexandria, and Caesar, with his small retinue of Roman soldiers, but he has a lot of ships, defeats the Egyptians, executes all the leaders. Ptolemy, I believe, either drowns or runs away. So there's Caesar with, she's 19. I remember she's young. How old is she about this time, Daisy?
She is about that age. She's young. She's under 20. Yeah.
Caesar is in his 40s, but romance follows and a child follows. So Caesar, after Caesar leaves, he's beckoned back to Rome. He has to leave. There are scenes of romance on the Nile, on the barges, and he leaves her behind. She eventually will come to Rome to to be in Rome when he is all powerful. But the Romans don't like Cleopatra. Why, Daisy?
They are suspicious of her as an outsider. They're suspicious of her as a queen. She is very different from most Roman women. She is very educated. She can speak 9 languages. And she has been having this relationship with Julius Caesar, and people can't quite get their head around what this actually means for the future of Rome. Does it mean that Egypt is going to be a lot more dominant? Um, it's a threatening sort of situation. There's a sort of sense as well that as an individual, she is manipulative. She is difficult. Cicero actually writes in a letter to one of his friends, I hate the queen. Another poet describes Cleopatra as being the whore queen of Egypt. So there's a lot of distaste surrounding her and her arrival in Rome.
She is a queen. Yes, and Caesar's not. Sometimes he's a dictator, sometimes he's first citizen, but she is a queen. Again, we need to describe what we think she looks like. Reminding me of Sappho, she's not automatically pretty, or how was she regarded by her contemporaries?
It's Cleopatra's appearance is one of those things. It's become sort of folklore that she was this really beguiling, beautiful woman. But the earliest sources we have, writings of after her time, but not a long, long time after, describe her as being really not out of the ordinary. And you can look at her portraits, which are contemporary with her on her coins, and she has quite a sort of a hooked nose. She has quite a prominent chin. She doesn't sort of adhere to conventional ideas of beauty. There are other busts which show her a little bit more favorably, but her appeal wasn't really in her sort of physical features so much as in her way of speaking. The one thing that all these sources seem to agree on is the fact that when she spoke, she was incredibly interesting to listen to. She had a way of sort of picking up someone else's manner of speaking and acquiring it herself and speaking to them in a way that they were comfortable with, as well as knowing all these different languages. So it's incredibly interesting, really, that her appeal lies more in her kind of cleverness and her sort of maybe more her kind of aura, we might say today, rather than her actual physical features.
In your conclusion, you remarked that the Romans saw Lucretia, who commits suicide, as virtuous and Cleopatra as vicious. How did they regard Cleopatra as dangerous, or just did they disdain her?
She was potentially dangerous. There was uncertainty over what she actually intended. And this is particularly looking later when she was having an affair with Mark Antony. She was seen to be sort of drawing him away from his Roman-born wife. He was then having to spend his time with her in Egypt. And there was a sense that she was a threat to some degree, even though people couldn't exactly define what that threat was.
It's more than 2,000 years later. Cleopatra stands up, Daisy. Would that have been a surprise to the Romans?
I think so. I think so. I think, you know, we have great admiration for her and her power, and she was actually incredibly capable. I mean, the fact that Alexandria improved a lot during her rule shows that she was actually a very, very talented ruler. And I think that our admiration for her, our respect for her would have surprised a lot of Romans today. Women in Roman society were by no means so visible or so sort of spoken about as she was. So I think they'd be quite surprised, yeah.
Here in the United States, I've never heard the word Lucretia outside of reading about who she was in the storytelling. Cleopatra, commonplacedly. How is it in Britain growing up? Did you ever hear Lucretia's name?
Only actually when I was looking at paintings. So in the National Gallery in London, there's a painting of Lucretia from Renaissance Italy. And so I knew of her in association with that more than I did with classical literature, which I think is quite interesting, but nowhere near as famous as Cleopatra.
Daisy Dunn is the author of The Missing Thread. Cleopatra. Caesar's dead. There's another civil war on. Mark Antony is seen as a man who practiced faithfulness to Caesar's memory. Brutus, the son of Servilia, lover of Caesar, is seen as a liberator, a man who revolted from the kingship of Caesar. Remember, the kingship fell into disrepute after Lucretia many centuries before. So the Romans, we're told, have a built-in antipathy to kingship. That's why the assassination, that's why Brutus and his colleagues thought they'd be celebrated and went out to the forum and waited for people to applaud them after they murdered Caesar. Didn't work out that way. However, during the Civil War, Mark Antony travels to Egypt, and Cleopatra again makes a great entrance, this time on her bards. There are paintings done in the 19th century about these moments. Our forebears in Europe and in Daisy Dunn's Britain have celebrated all these scenes in their own way, almost as if you could say the Romans and the Greeks give us stories, and each generation and each epoch since the 2000 or 2500 years interprets those stories in different ways. Right now, we're coming to the story of Antony and Cleopatra. They had a love affair, and it was a doozy. Daisy, what is the opinion at the time of Antony spending all that time with Cleopatra, and who was Fulvia?
Antony's affair with Cleopatra made him really unpopular with the Roman people. It was seen to be excessive. Romans didn't like kind of what we'd say today as a PDA, a public display of affection. They didn't like that one bit. And the fact that she was in Egypt and he was spending most of his time there away from his Roman-born family was incredibly difficult for people to cope with. And Fulvia was actually his Roman-born wife. He was married sort of several times, Mark Antony, again, another womanizer of history. But Fulvia was a woman who was quite politically engaged in Rome. And one of the sort of the great moments in history sees her actually take action to, I'd say, to sort of promote Mark Antony in Rome. At this point, we've got Julius Caesar's died. His nephew and heir is Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, and he's a potential rival to Mark Antony. And Fulvia can see this. And you essentially get this power play occur between Mark Antony, between Octavian, and between Fulvia. And she takes decisive action by actually stirring up a war in Mark Antony's name.
Yes, a war that takes very damaging to the Republic. I think it's in modern Perugia. Is that where it took place?
Perugia, yeah, exactly. In Italy, she and Mark Antony's brother stir up war. They get troops, and they are essentially fighting against the men that Octavian pulls together. And it culminates in a very, very bloody siege between these two opposing sides. And we have actual evidence of this because there are weapons, these kind of slingshot bullets, which have been uncovered, excavated from the ground at this particular site. And some of these, I mean, they're very, very rude. If you think about the Second World War, bombs were often inscribed with messages for the enemy. Same thing happened back in Roman history.
Yes, the Romans, I wanted to mention that. They're exceedingly vulgar by our standards here in the 21st century. At the same time, you kind of laugh afterwards going, well, they don't waste words when they're unhappy. I also thought, I wanted to mention to you, Daisy, they're incredibly fertile. Everybody gets pregnant all the time. It's
yes. Well, I think this is like the sort of with Romans in particular, sort of looking at people who are, I mean, I'm English, so you have none of that English reserve. You don't sort of conceal your emotion. They're very open with what they think, and they're very outspoken.
yes.
And you find this even among some of these women, which is quite surprising. These women who otherwise, as you say, are sort of there giving birth again and again and again to children because they start so early. This is their point. I mean, a lot of these girls are being married off at the age of about 14 and then having their first babies, still in their teenage years.
Yes, but it's colorful. I go for that and exciting. La Dolce Vita, long before there was in Italy. We come now to the end of Cleopatra and Antony. It's very famous. It happens again, economy of scene. Octavian conquers Antony. Antony commits suicide, but not very well because he dies slowly. And there's a reuniting with Cleopatra. There's a lot of hemming and hawing about how it happens. And he bleeds to death in front of her. And at this point, she decides to destroy herself. Why? What was her motive?
At that point, she could see there'd be no happy future for her or for her children. She tried to sort of bargain with the victor, with Octavian Augustus, tried to say, please, could there be show mercy to my children? But she has no real hope because what Octavian Augustus wants to do is to take her alive, drag her to Rome, and just show her off as like a kind of trophy in one of these triumphal parades, which the Romans really loved. And that's the last thing she possibly want. So she sort of knows that the more honorable way out in the sort of the ancient way of thinking would be to take her own life, a bit like Lucretia before her.
Yes, it's it's a rough scene because Cleopatra tries out poisons. The story is that she used an asp, a snake. Who knows? Maybe she was murdered. Maybe Octavian. I don't think Octavian murdered her, but there are scenes here that are really hard to believe, Daisy. Have you ever heard anybody doubt some of these scenes? Because they're all tricked up between us and what happened is Shakespeare. Does that change your understanding of these scenes?
Well, I think Shakespeare handled this so marvelously. And I think when you read the original sources filtered through Shakespeare, you appreciate just how dramatic those early original accounts are. And they seem too contrived in a way to be true. I mean, it defies belief today that she would have had this basket brought in with some fruit, with asps hiding beneath, and then die as a result of it. It just seems quite far-fetched. But, another interpretation people have sometimes applied to this is saying, well, maybe the asp story was invented because there were some puncture marks on her arm, and maybe it was a kind of lethal injection instead. And I think when you read about it in that way and you consider that as a possibility, that seems slightly more credible.
Is it significant that the Romans seem to like suicide for the end for women? I know we've already named two of them, Lucretia and Dido, and now we have Cleopatra. Was that their understanding of drama? It's not really important unless she kills herself?
I mean, suicide takes on importance both for men and for women, and it's seen in certain situations to be a better course. I mean, the whole sort of philosophy, we talk about Stoicism today. Stoicism's enjoyed a bit of a kind of revival, but ancient Stoicism is quite different. And you get sort of a lot of Stoic figures basically arguing that, I think one of them puts it, if a room becomes too smoky, it's better to take the easier way out, by which he means take your own life. And there was a kind of respect, I think, for some of those people who did that. And this is very difficult because our views of suicide are so different today. The ancient mindset is very, very different here from our own. So I want to be careful here talking about this. But in Cleopatra's case, certainly her suicide was a cause of frustration to the Romans. There might have been some admiration for her bravery and surprise, perhaps, at that moment. But it was ultimately for the victorious Roman Octavian Augustus, it was incredibly frustrating because he didn't get his life trophy.
The book is The Missing Thread, A Women's History of the Ancient World. Daisy Dunn is the author. Now we come to Augustus, formerly Octavian. Not a warrior-looking young man. However, a man who is Roman in the fashion that his wife has a child and he announces her on the birth bed, I divorce you. and he takes up with a married woman, or the woman who was married. She might be widowed, I don't remember. Her name is Livia. And he takes up with her and stays with her the rest of his life. What do we need to know about Livia? Because Robert Graves turned her into a poisoner. No, I reject that. But what was she, Daisy?
Lydia is incredibly interesting, another very clever, politically expedient woman. She was actually forced to divorce her husband and to hand over her children to the ex-husband in order to marry Augustus. And she was there while he was turning essentially the Roman Republic into an empire. He was the first person who is changing Roman politics, for a very, very long time. He has some precedent. His great uncle, Julius Caesar, had really kind of rocked the boat. But he's got to build a dynasty now. And Livia is seen to be essential to building that dynasty. Unfortunately, Augustus and Livia don't manage to have children together. But she has two boys of her own, and one of those boys is Tiberius. And Tiberius, in time, will be adopted by Emperor Augustus and become the next figure in this dynasty. So Livia is key, really, to the establishment of the Roman Empire, the whole new system of rule. But she's also incredibly helpful to Augustus. She's almost his kind of right-hand woman in a way. She plays a role in diplomacy. People from abroad actually prevail on her when they were facing the death sentence. She plays a role in politics as well as being there at Augustus's side.
One other woman around Octavian, important, his daughter Julia. The only one will be his successor. I mean, will survive of all the children he conceives. And he bullied her, made her do this and that. But eventually he said, you've got to marry Marcus Agrippa. And that, my reading of that is that it was a happy marriage. She traveled with him. She had several children. My memory is 5.
Mm-hmm.
He was the hero of Actium. He was the admiral to Octavian's imperator. But Julia didn't, after Marcus Agrippa died, things didn't work out for her. But her grandchildren, wasn't her grandchildren the people that were dying sort of mysteriously? Was Germanicus her grandchild? Was her child?
So it's a very complicated family tree. So after Agrippa dies, she is forced to marry her stepbrother Tiberius. And they absolutely can't stand each other. So they don't have a happy marriage. But she has, as you say, these 5 children by Agrippa. And one of them is Agrippina the Elder, who marries Germanicus, who becomes an enemy of Tiberius. So it's all quite messy and knotty and complicated.
Very complicated, but it's all one family, Julian and Claudian. Tolstoy, right? All happy families are the same, right? But
Right.
now, we'll get back on the line of Livia and Tiberius. I want to just pause here to say that the Julian Claudian family was rocked by the challenge of succession. It's hard to find, after Augustus, it's hard to find somebody who died in his sleep. Can you find one?
The majority of these emperors after Augustus, I have to say, do not have natural deaths. Most of them are suspected of being poisoned or killed.
It all of a sudden it becomes, well, to read it from the outside, I have to read it in English. It becomes violence. You're emperor, but you know you're going to end violently. You mentioned Tiberius, who retreats to Capri, I believe, and Rome is turned over to the hands of the senators and a couple of rascals who work for Tiberius. And following Tiberius is Caligula. Or to say that Caligula has a relationship with women is far-fetched. What was he? What was he to the women? Did everybody run away from him?
I mean, he was a lech of the first order, the way he's described. He's said to have committed incest with all 3 of his sisters. He had one particular favorite sister who he essentially made into a goddess after she died. Any man who came round for dinner with his wife could pretty much guarantee that during that dinner, Caligula would run off with the wife and then come back at some point during the meal looking a bit disheveled with the poor woman as well. He is meant to have had just absolutely prolific tastes and have been, I mean, Caligula really is painted as a monster in the sources. It's difficult to deny that.
Yes, and where did he learn that? Was that it? Couldn't have been his father. Who was his mother? I don't remember.
So his mother was Agrippina the Elder, who had
Ah,
a
that's
great
right.
sort of role in the German military. She was fantastic. I mean, I think as a woman, it's very difficult to say that he learned these his ways from him. People instead sometimes blame Tiberius because as a teenager, Caligula went off to live with Tiberius for a while. And it was in that period where Tiberius was said to have been very perverted. So people make that connection.
Yes, that's fair enough. And besides, Caligula would have always wondered whether he was going to be murdered next because all of his older brothers were died mysteriously.
Yeah.
All right, Agrippina the Younger. Now, there is an act. Who was she?
Agrippina the Younger is best known to history for being the mother of Emperor Nero. And she was a lot more than that. She is, again, another kind of very feisty, very astute, very clever woman. And the fact is that Nero becomes emperor when he's only 16 years old. So at the very beginning of his rule, she is essentially co-emperor, not in name, but in effect. And on the coins, she's shown side by side, her face is there with her sons. And as time goes on, and Nero gets a little bit older and more kind of rebellious in his teenage years, he wants absolutely nothing to do with her and really resents her having any control or power whatsoever.
At one point, one of his marriages, I believe, is Messalina. Is that correct? And Messalina, what a surprise! A daughter-in-law doesn't get along with her mother-in-law, but boy, this is a duo. What happens?
This is very difficult. So Messalina is actually not Nero's wife, but Emperor Claudius. Sorry, these family
Oh,
trees are
that's
very
right.
complicated.
Fine.
Yeah, so she becomes a third wife of Emperor Claudius. But as a duo, these two women are both written about as if they are the most notorious women in Rome in that period. So Agrippina, on the one hand, is this very pushy mother, very kind of politically engaged. She seems to be wanting power, according to some of the historians. Messalina, on the other hand, is this very beautiful woman who's being forced to marry the rather unattractive Emperor Claudius, who actually Agrippina then marries after her and becomes the fourth wife. It's very complicated. Anyway, Messalina is actually accused of being a prostitute on the side of being an empress and actually going out, putting on a blonde wig and working in the brothel because she was supposedly so sexually insatiable.
Yes, it gets very complicated because Claudius dies suddenly of what presumably is poison. There's even a poisoner named who becomes famous. It's at this point, the bodies are falling in all directions. I went too fast to Nero. Nero's the end. There is
Yeah.
no Julian Claudian after Nero. So here we have our final moments with Daisy Dunn. Daisy, your conclusion is that we have to look at each epoch separately, and we can't run them all together, although the tendency is that. My reading for your very helpful book is that the Greeks were far more serious and much less bloody-minded than the Romans. How do you compare the two? We have 30 seconds.
I'd say the Romans are a lot more politically sort of savvy in the way they go about their sort of politics and familial sort of relations. I think in Greece it's harder to get an idea because there are like 1,000 different city-states, so it's hard to generalize. But I think as a writer, Roman politics really is incredibly exciting to write about, and as a historian, it's what I love.
Yes, 2,000 years later, same place, different language. Daisy Dunn, The Missing Thread, A Women's History of the Ancient World. I'm John Batchelor.